Welcome to the Integral Stage's first polarity dialogue. In a polarity dialogue or debate, both participants will be required to make positive and negative cases for the same position before coming together at the end to winnow down the arguments to their strongest points or to arrive at a statement which can affirm both sides at once. This is our first experiment with this format, and we may refine or adjust it as we go forward. In today's discussion, we'll explore the question of whether consciousness goes all the way down in the universe, whether it is an elemental or emergent property of the world. I'm Bruce Alderman, and joining me for the dialogue is Dr. Jake Bottom Turtle, or is it Turtle Bottom, as played by Layman Pascal. Okay, so welcome, Layman. Looking forward to our exploration of this topic together. We're going to be looking at this big question of, does consciousness go all the way down? And down where is a good question, right? So, all right, so I'm going to open, and then we'll just see where this takes us.
Sure, sounds good. There we go. That's the look.
Yeah. So, a core implication of the four-quadrant model is that the four quadrants are coessential, meaning they're at least fundamental since the beginning of the Big Bang. They go all the way down to at least the Big Bang, and that means some form of consciousness, interiority, subjectivity, or sentience goes all the way down and is present at all levels of material organization. Is this believable, that even particles or atoms or molecules are conscious? One could argue that this tenet alone is significant reason why integral theory isn't given much credence in academic circles. Consciousness is a notoriously slippery concept in philosophy, and it may be slippery because there's nothing there to grasp. It just could be a phantom. At present, our state of knowledge indicates that we really have two viable paths forward. Recognizing that consciousness may be a tired and outdated metaphysical concept, and dropping it altogether from our vocabularies is the best course of action. Or, if we grant its existence, at least not being so radical as to suggest it's present even in microbes or single-celled organisms, or even further down in prebiotic matter. In other words, accepting that whatever it is, it's a latecomer in the universe and is not elemental. It emerges at some point. Does the signifier consciousness have a referent? Does it point to anything at all, or is it just a useful fiction? William James famously questioned whether there was any entity there at all that could bear this name. More recently, we have the illuminated materialists, who suggest that the word consciousness belongs to the same family of folk theory concepts that have all gone by the wayside as science has progressed, like the four elements, the humors, the ether in astrophysics, or phlogiston in chemistry. At one time, we thought the four elements were, well, elemental. But as our understanding of chemistry and physics advanced, we found that these elemental properties were not fundamental in any way, at least not in the way that we had assumed. They were composed of other things and did not have any intrinsic existence in themselves. Similarly, genetics, biology, and thermodynamics helped us to surrender the concept of a fundamental or necessary élan vital, or life force. So science has toppled a host of metaphysical entities inherited from our pre-scientific folk theories, and there's no reason to assume that consciousness will not go the same way. Neuroscience demonstrates that so-called immaterial conscious processes basically are all neurological events. Is there any reason to suppose that consciousness is anything other than these processes? What does the addition of the concept of consciousness add to our understanding? Paul and Patricia Churchland, of course, are the most famous of the proponents of this eliminative orientation. For them, consciousness is at best a fuzzy, ill-defined metaphysical stand-in for a host of more discrete, independent, and interdependent neurological processes. Some weak-minded, cowardly people are not satisfied with this radical approach and prefer to hold on to the security blanket just a little bit longer. But they do so with a few caveats and concessions. So let's say the word consciousness does point to something real, something which, as many argue, is just intuitively and immediately present to us. The fact of our own experience, the fact of our awareness and cognizance. Even if we grant this, it doesn't mean we must therefore slide into the abyss of metaphysical idealism. We don't have to give up the compelling testimony of the physical sciences that physical processes are fundamental, pervasive, in some sense primordial. We do not have any empirical evidence currently to support Wilber's radical, disgusting notion that consciousness goes all the way down. But many are still satisfied to accept that, at least at the human level, and likely at mammalian or at least the multicellular organism level, consciousness is a real factor in the makeup of life forms, meaning organisms engage in semiotic exchanges or acts of interpretation and appear to be capable of some forms of experience. Consciousness here is not a metaphysical ultimate, but an emergent property of matter, a dynamic material or paramaterial process that arises once material elements become sufficiently networked. We haven't yet pinned down exactly what degree of networking is necessary to give rise to consciousness as we understand it. But given the findings in recent interspecies psychological experiments, it's safe to conservatively put it at least at the level of mammals or birds. There are still good reasons to remain open-minded about whether consciousness exhibits top-down causation, meaning it not only emerges from matter but then can reach back and affect matter, or whether it merely supervenes on material forms. But those emergentists within the integral community, at least, are likely to grant some degree of top-down causation, some room for recognizing consciousness as a genuine ontological emergent with the capacity to act creatively and to influence the world that gave rise to it. But to venture beyond this is to venture into the realm of metaphysical wishful thinking and will only impede scientific progress or the academic acceptance of integral theory. Wilber's got to cut it out. So that's my opening gambit.
Wow, okay. The little or no consciousness argument.
Yeah.
That's a great tongue-in-cheek or half tongue-in-cheek intellectual overview of where a lot of people are on that topic. But I think a great deal more people are in a much more personal place with it. And I think that's where I'd start, is trying to get a sense of, like, if I were to speak from my weak-minded, cowardly self, why it seems to me that not only is consciousness there, but goes all the way down. And then that self is either a source of evidence for the pro-consciousness argument, or by arguing from that self, I'm objectifying it and stepping out of it, and it's a good position from which to critique that opinion. So I start with myself, and my first point of view is, well, I seen it, you know, meditative, psychedelic, devotional, and fluke experiences of various kinds have repeatedly given me certain kinds of unusual experiences that I'm happy with. And there's been a type of experience which is not just heightened self-awareness or a change of mood and functionality or emptiness, or it's not even that weird thing where you seem like you fall out the back of your head and see yourself through somebody's eyes. But there's a recurring situation in which you perceive the total perceptual field gazing back at you, as if it had more or less the same characteristics that you associate with your self-identity. and that's an observational condition. And not only is it an observational condition, but the force of that inspection has some quality in it that's implicitly self-validating. It's like a Cartesian argument. When you're going through it, you can't discredit it. So phenomenological tautology available through peak experiences. That's my first point. And then the second one is, other than seeing it, I smell it. You know, that there's a residual from these experiences that I seem to catch a whiff of all the time. So that when I look around and I look at things, I don't seem to see them as inert things. I seem to see them as pervaded with something that is at least minimally gazing back. And that's an easy observation for me to overlook, right? I can dismiss it in my general day-to-day life, but when I actually inspect what it is that I'm looking at, the gaze back seems to be a pervasive and obvious feature of that. And why would I discount that evidence when I'm leaving all the rest of the features of what I see intact? And then, of course, there's the argument from lots of other people believe it too, which is not a totally credible argument, but it does have some emotional and moral sway over all of us, I think. You imagine the group of people you think might be behind this thing. And certainly if you brought up the idea that it might be politically pragmatic for integral theory to drop this idea in order to make itself more acceptable, then that's an argument from a different domain. So it suggests that we might be able to make this argument from different other domains, right? You might be able to make an ethical argument. The ethical argument would be, if you allow something like consciousness to be omnipervasive, go all the way up and down the scale, then you operate towards all of the possibilities of the universe in a more ethical manner. And if you discount that possibility, then you draw a line at which you cease to really be a reciprocal ethical agent. You draw that line at living organisms or at people or something like that, and you never get to have the moral experience of really working with matter. And so it might be that whether it's true or not, consciousness all the way down is an orienting position from which human beings can have a maximally ethical engagement with the world. It might be existentially pragmatic to do so. And then another thing I would look at is parapsychological data, which again, not overwhelming, but there's various interesting hints. I've seen a number of people trying to do experiments where you interfere with quantum phenomenon through intention. Now, I'm not a wave collapse guy. I don't think consciousness collapses the wave. In fact, I don't think the wave collapses. But I think there are things you can look at in terms of the microstructure of the objective world, where it's suggestive that there are ways for thoughts and feelings when directed to cause skewings of probabilities. And this would suggest that whatever we call subjectivity has something enough like itself that there can be an interaction of that kind. That even at the smallest scale of matter, there's something there to receive a subjective exchange. And we might as well call that a subjectivity of some kind. And then I would also, to me, it seems like there's a category error in the notion of the emergence of subjectivity from objectivity, because we're extrapolating from a series of objective emergence, right? That there's a material emergence and it's going in some areas of reality in a more and more complex direction. And you're looking at this entire history of objective emergence, one after the other. And then all of a sudden, you're going to splice in the subjective, when really it's of a different quality, right? It's not something that we look at from the outside. You go, here's a whole chain of things we look at from the outside, and then somewhat arbitrarily, I'm going to take a phenomenon that I don't look at from the outside and place it at the end of that chain. It seems like that would have to be a justified maneuver. It's not an obvious maneuver to make. The person who wanted to do that, who wanted to put subjectivity at the end of a long chain of object mutations, the burden of proof would be on them. Otherwise, the natural experience would be the parsimonious suggestion, which is to say that subjectivity is simply a different category of phenomenon than those objects. Well, that's largely where I would go with it, is personal experience as well as some kind of category error. And the category error, I mean, to me, it looks like people have discovered some pools of boiling water and asked themselves whether boiling goes all the way down. Like, does boiling exist at every temperature of water? No? Well, then it's not down there. But that's a misinterpretation of the phenomenon, because boiling is an instance of the thermal activation of water. And the thermal activation of water does go all the way down. It goes all the way down to 0 Kelvin, at which point the concept that water is water doesn't apply anymore. So what we call consciousness strikes me as a phenomenon of a fairly interesting grade, like the boiling of water, but that's only an instance of what the underlying phenomenon is. And I think that that underlying phenomenon will go down as far as the definitions of things normally apply. If you go down farther than the normal application of the definition of things, then nothing applies. Maybe there's no consciousness at all. Maybe there's no things at all. But, you know, the game's off at that point. So as far down as we can see, it's plausible to me that consciousness goes all the way down. I have personal experience. I have confirmation from other people that they've had similar experiences. I have a general sense that that's actually what I'm perceiving, even when I look with my eyes. I believe it heightens the appropriate human ethical engagement in the material universe. And I think the burden of proof is on somebody who wants to suggest that such an obvious thing isn't there.
That's not going to be me.
Okay, that's all I can muster for that one. That's my pro argument. I've got an anti argument.
Well, you've done a very fine job with the pro argument. I know the crowd from which I was speaking and to which we might be speaking in some degrees would probably have problems with the appeal to personal experience. But again, you've laid out that possibly you're looking in two different domains. For me also, experience is compelling, and the practice that you described of looking out at the experiential or phenomenal field and feeling gazed back upon is definitely something I recognize well, and it's actually a form of practice that I like to do. I like to go in a forest and flip subject-object experience, and you know, to my intuitive sense, it doesn't feel like just a imaginal exercise. When I really open myself to that experience of seeing, it definitely feels, at least to me, more like it's more than just a fantasy, more than just a creative reconstruction. If you open yourself to that level of sensibility, I definitely resonate with and can recognize what you're talking about in terms of being in a field of mutual exchange, mutual relation, mutual regard, not saying or anthropomorphically projecting the same kind of regard on trees that I would give to them, but nevertheless feeling in an interior kind of co-relationship, a co-presence, that, you know, if I was stepping outside of the circle that's demanding empirical, measurable, objective evidence, to me is compelling. But yeah, to flip where I was coming from, since it's my task now to really, make a positive case for this, and I really appreciated your ethical argument. That makes sense to me. Seeing that, and we can see good examples of that in the practice of vivisection, for instance. It became justifiable to operate on living animals once we could basically convince ourselves that they were not having subjective experiences and that their screams were merely mechanical processes without any subjective or feeling element to them. And once we basically abandoned that, it widened the field of our ethical practice and concern. So I think that's a powerful argument as well. If it's again not compelling to the Frank Vitzers or David Longs who might be watching this. So looking basically at kind of the arguments that I was making before about emergence, I think, and also the eliminative materialist point of view. To me, the eliminative materialist point of view really is not compelling, if only just because of the testimony of immediate experience and or in somewhat the way that Daniel Dennett functions. I might have to read him more deeply or more fully, but every time I engage with his work or watch him speaking, the same thing that I take away is he's poking holes in the way that experience is constructed, such that we can't take experience to be we can't take it at face value, and that what we receive is what is necessarily given, or that what is constructed captures everything that happened. So he pokes holes in that and basically, gives truth to the critique of the myth of the given. That whatever we do experience is not necessarily just given to us phenomenally by the world. There's a great deal of construction that goes on there. But I have not seen him really do away with the sense that, or to me, the fact that experience is happening, regardless of how it's constructed or what holes might be there. If people have come across more compelling arguments that he has made, I hope they'll make it in comments to this video discussion, but I haven't come across that. He hasn't convinced me that there's something really paradoxical to claim that that consciousness is an illusion when an illusion is an experiential event in consciousness, right? So it seems to be a self-refuting kind of position. And I think the same thing goes for the Churchland's argument. They can definitely point to neural correlates, but they really don't seem to get at the fact of experience. And I think that's important. And that really takes us to the emergentist model. And emergentists will suggest that, as I stated in the opening statement, we have to reach a certain level of complexity in the organization of matter before consciousness emerges. I think David Chalmers' distinction between weak emergence and strong emergence is important here. And most of us are familiar with forms of weak emergence. There are new patterns of organization that become manifest at certain degrees of complexity of interactions. Water molecules in sufficient number and in the right conditions will produce waves. Certain molecules put together produce themselves the qualities of water that are not present individually in the molecular components themselves. So we see new emergent patterns, new emergent structures, but they're really all of a kind. And so all of these are forms of weak emergence. They're just new patterns, unexpected patterns within basically the same terrain of stuff. Whereas consciousness appears to be something radically different. And Chalmers argues that consciousness is the only form of radical or strong emergence that we know of. And to me, you can accept the emergentist model and say, okay, once we have enough of these little singular, these little robots in the brain running around, it produces consciousness. We might accept that, but and Chalmers at one level seems to do so, at least give a nod to it. But the kind of leap that actually takes place is not one that we have any precedent for anywhere else, where there's a leap across an apparent ontological gap. In the giving arise, in the giving rise to something that is so fundamentally different from its parts. Why do totally insentient, interiorless objects, when they're organized in a particular way, give rise to subjectivity, quality, feeling? At most, I think you could make an argument that certain kinds of informational exchange or signal exchange might become possible with a certain degree of complexity of organization, as you can find in software, but it doesn't account for that emergence of quality of experience of subjectivity of some kind. I think arguments can be made against panpsychism about mind or psyche going all the way down. We don't want to project human qualities of consciousness all the way down. But it seems to me more parsimonious to say that rather than at some level of organization of insentient matter, suddenly something radically different emerges, to say instead that matter at all levels has at least two qualities. What Chalmers, I'm not a Chalmers follower necessarily, but I want to use his phrase of phenomenal information. And it embraces both the qualitative aspect and the fact that there are semiotic exchanges that take place. And I think it's more parsimonious to assume that at every level of material organization there are semiotic exchanges, and that there is some quality of what its likeness to those semiotic or informational exchanges at every level. It doesn't mean that those exchanges are in any way similar to human consciousness or the experience of I am or love or anything else. But at least we can, if we fold those two things into our conceptualization of matter, that objects or material forms engage in semiotic exchanges at all levels, and that there's something it's like to engage in that semiotic exchange. To me, that's compelling, and that's more parsimonious than positing a mythical point at some halfway line, halfway point along the timeline of the universe, in which suddenly this miraculous event of the emergence of consciousness takes place. There are common sense arguments against this about does it make sense that that chemicals are aware, chemical systems are aware, or that a cup or a thermostat is aware? And the way I see it is, it really depends on the pattern of organization of that object. Is it a heap, or is it a holon? Is it a coherent whole? Is it self-organizing? Is it autopoietic or allopoietic? If it's autopoietic, if it's self-organizing, then it has enough internal coherence to, you could say, distribute the exchange of phenomenal information throughout itself, to give rise to some kind of interiority to that object at the level of that object itself. In the Santiago theory of cognition, basically the self-referential loop of the self-maintaining object is cognition itself. In the process of autopoiesis, as the organism is self-referring and putting itself together, maintaining itself, exchanging signals, that itself is its cognitive process. And that means even a chemical system that is a dissipative structure, may not be a living organism. To me, it's not too far out to posit that there is some degree of interiority even in a dissipative chemical system that's prebiotic, pre-life organism. So that's my argument really in favor of it, that it really is parsimonious in terms of just like a basic scientific metaphysics.
Yeah.
And it's no less rational than an emergentist account. In fact, I think there's some elements that are more rational, because the emergentist account actually posits a an ontological leap that is replicated in no other form of emergence that we've been able to observe. It's a qualitatively different kind of emergence. And so there's a little bit of sleight of hand going on, I feel, in the basic emergentist account.
Good. I mean, people must be seeing the same sleight of hand from different angles, right? Because I'm like you, and what I was saying earlier, I feel like the burden of proof would be on trying to make the assertion that subjectivity is an emergent property of an otherwise objective series of emergences,
right?
Because it's qualitatively unlike the other emergences.
Right.
So to me, the burden of proof is on that strange argument. But from their point of view, they must have a feeling that the burden of proof would be on the other argument.
Right.
And I think part of it is the word is confusing, right? It may be conflating, like you were saying at the beginning, a number of different phenomenon. Because a lot of what people talk about when they're dismissive or seemingly reductive of consciousness is they're describing behavior. They're describing the behavior of a class of entities that they refer to as conscious. And they think, well, if we could get that behavior out of the system, then consciousness emerged out of the system that I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. Whereas a whole bunch of other people are using that word to describe some much more primal experiential quality that they're not thinking of it as having anything to do with behavior at all. Mm-hmm. And then there's this third option where are there particular kinds of behavior where the interpretation of consciousness or something like consciousness would turn out to be necessary in order to really explain that efficiently. That's, right. I think we're not sure about that. People are working towards that. And then on the flip side of that, because that's a very high level, are we seeing those things? Way down at the bottom of things, the question of what is anything cuts through both of those sides, right? Whether it's, I like Nietzsche, and so I like his idea that if you look at the behavior of energy, you essentially need something like intentionality in order to describe it. It has something like agency. It has appetition in Spinoza's phrase, right? It's as if it wants to do what it's doing. Mm-hmm. Or people who are information theorists might say, look, if everything's information, then information transduces itself, and every instance of a thing encountering or recognizing another thing is information encountering and recognizing other information, and therefore information must, at the most basic level, have the capacity to experience or transduce other information. Mm-hmm. And if that's at the most basic possible level of our conception of reality, then it would be all the way through all the levels and scales of our conception of reality. Mm-hmm. But that's still on my pro argument. Like, what's my anti-argument?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there's a switch here, right? And I like this because most people are having this kind of discussion and they're not coming from the place we are, which I think is of interest to people who've had experiences where it seemed like consciousness is all pervading. So we want to move this discussion out of its normal framework into one that embraces that particular difference. And I've noticed that most of my pro arguments are from the subjective position, either the subjective position of I experienced this, or other people experienced it in the first person, or as myself, there's an ethical aspirational orientation in there. And when I switch to the anti-argument, I'm switching to a much more externally oriented argument. So what causes me doubt? What causes me to think I don't need consciousness all the way down? The first thing is, obviously, those experiences, like any experiences, like perception itself, like meditation, they aren't ontological proofs just because you're experiencing them. Mirages do exist. And anything you experience might not, in the objective sense, be the thing you think you're experiencing. Doesn't in any way invalidate your experience, but it does mean your experience does not speak to the objective reality of the phenomenon. So the entire premise of science, the entire premise of the progress human beings have made in the last few centuries, and the position from which people can be decent to each other, is that we need to enact a higher degree of verification. We need higher validity than we've been previously using. And if these phenomena can't meet that validity, then maybe we should dispense with them. It doesn't matter that they seem real and everyone can keep having them, and they might be extremely important to people's lives, but they don't necessarily therefore form part of the description of the actual objective nature of reality. And, you can go then farther down that path and say, why would people have these experiences if they don't form part of the general description of reality? Well, there's lots of ways to justify the experience without making the seemingly wild assertion that it's a ubiquitous universal quality, right? If I perceive that there's an intelligence somewhat like myself gazing back to me from my entire perceptual field, well, maybe there's a good bet that that's me, and it's not going on anywhere else in the universe, right? Even if my brain, even just at the physical level, if my brain is generating this neurological hologram out of the incoming electromagnetic and informational data, then it's a good bet that some trace of my self-organization system is spread like a reflection over that pond of ripples. And so everywhere I would look, I would see it, but that's not proof that it's everywhere, because I'm not looking everywhere. I'm only looking where I'm looking, and everywhere else it might be absent. So to me, that's a pretty compelling argument. It's a serious concern. I can't verify it one way or the other, but it's got to give me pause that I can't just extrapolate from the ubiquity of my experience to the ubiquity of everything. Another part of it is, if I look at something like the integral model or any kind of developmental nested emergent hold-on type argument, where you have something like subjectivity emerging out of subjectivities, along with objectivities emerging out of objectivities, as they go down, they become less and less significant, right? There's the famous significant versus basic or fundamental, right? So if you go, if my organs have some sentience, I'm assuming it's less significant than mine because I put a lot of organs together. And whatever the subjectivity of the cells that make up those organs, also possibly real but less significant. And we could go down into the molecules and down into the atoms and down into subatomic phenomenon. And you've gone down a very long way. And so even if you were to take the assumption that there was a subjective correlate at each of those scales, pretty soon you're coming to a scale where it's virtually nothing, where the subjective correlate is so insignificant that we might as well call it no consciousness, because it lacks all of the things we'd like consciousness to have. It basically falls outside of our definition at that point. It doesn't mean that there's no cognitive or subjective potential at every scale. It does mean that it's not what we're talking about, not what we're looking for at those scales. So why even call it that? It might deserve a completely different name at that scale. And then I make those arguments to myself, and they're very compelling, but they don't stand up very well against the overwhelming immediacy of transcendental experience. An argument that does stand up for me pretty well is the idea that you can drown in a couple inches of water in the bathtub, right? That although I might say to myself, it was infinite consciousness, that really it only had to be a little bit more than me for me to think it was infinite. I look out at the sky and it looks like it goes forever, but it doesn't. It just goes bigger than I can see. So these phenomenon could be larger than us without being omnipresent at all scales. And I think the behavioral argument is a compelling one, because we see some kind of process in complex systems like ourselves, and maybe in the other animals, maybe in the plants, maybe in the cells. And at some point there is a cutoff. There are forms of complexity that, even though a quark is a very complex thing and it might be straddling dimensions in the multiverse, I don't know what it's going to do next, it's not exhibiting the same type of complexity that I see in organic phenomenon, right? And so consciousness in that sense is very closely related to life, right? Sentience and sapience and sensitivity and whatever's going on in the irritability of organisms. There's at least a strong analogy between life and consciousness. And life is something that is present in these systems and also vanishes from these systems. It is not ubiquitous. It's not eternally present in the systems we're looking at, right? A living deer and a deer that I shoot in the forest They both have a whole bunch of iron compounds in their body. So I can look at, if I looked at that dimension and went, there's a pure continuum of iron. This living one has iron and this dead one has iron. There's iron in both places. There's iron all over. And in fact, there is iron. It's in the ground. It's in the trees where I shot the deer. There's a general pervasiveness of this quality. But that doesn't tell me anything about the change that I caused in the deer. Life is gone from the deer. Why wouldn't consciousness also be gone? The fact that you can identify continuously existing qualities between things in different states doesn't mean that those qualities determine what's significant in the phenomenon we're looking at. So I would say, I could argue that consciousness is more like life. It's a significant phenomenon that vanishes from things, even when you can find a continuity between the states of the thing before and after. So to me, those are all, that's how I would chastise my own pro-consciousness argument.
Yeah, all of that lands with me as well, you know, and even as I was pronouncing to you my own experience of engaging in intersubjective exchange with my experiential field, very aware that that could be, despite its compelling quality, nevertheless magnified, you know, basically reflective of my own internal process. We all know that we've had dreams. I don't know why flying dreams are especially so, but we've all had dreams that seem even more real than waking life sometimes. And that testimony doesn't necessarily say anything. So the demand for, you know, greater empirical rigor, greater rigor in our demands for support is definitely merited, and I agree with that. And I think within this broadly integral diasporic community, you know, we've basically got to accept and honor that demand for rigor. And in a way, although I am, you know, through a lot of my work, you know, proponent of post-metaphysics, I think we're kind of coming up against, you know, still the question of metaphysics and what kind of metaphysics is useful for us, generative for us, flexible enough that, you know, it merits at least entertainment, if not fundamentalist adherence, right? And so I actually am fine with an emergentist model. I think it doesn't make a lot of sense that something radically different emerges just suddenly at one point. But it really depends on what we're looking at, you know. But I'm not fundamentally, you know, in a religious sense committed to, you know, panpsychism or pansemiotics or something as absolutely necessary. It becomes a question for me of just what seems to be a metaphysical model that will give me the most mileage and help us at this point address the most issues that confront us. And I think it's interesting that out of materialism, materialist philosophy right now, we are seeing the upwelling of various versions of panpsychism or pansemiotics in object-oriented ontology and speculative realism, where they really take materialism to its metaphysical limits, you know, limits in quotation marks, limits for our present station, you know, from how we've been looking so far and challenging some of those assumptions. And, you know, one of the moves is to move away from anthropocentrism and to move towards a decentralized orientation. And in one sense, you know, the emergentist model, you know, especially if it really only sees it as possible for human beings, that, you know, what we recognize as consciousness is really only a human property. Obviously, that still leaves us in anthropocentrism. There's something that's going on with Graham Harman's work or Levi Bryant's work or Stephen Shaviro's work. They're all coming from radically different angles, and I would contrast them with Ray Brassier and a few others who seem to be leaning more in the eliminative direction. But among those like Harman and Bryant, there is a recognition that objects at all scales translate differences. Even a chair, that's impacted by a hammer will translate differences throughout it. And there's something, it's like there's an informational exchange and a change that's rendered in that system through those kinds of encounters, and that registration of difference. It's a difference that makes a difference. It's how are we going to look at that? How are we going to frame that? And when we are confronted with various challenges in the way that we relate to each other, the way that we relate to nature, the way that we exploit the earth, that we consider other living beings as resources. All of those flow from basic metaphysical assumptions about basically a lack of interiority, a lack of ability to have, or a lack of possession of any quality of consciousness. So even if it's in some sense a myth, to me it remains a compelling myth and a useful myth, recognizing that the pretension, I think in the materialist camp, that the physicalist account of the world is not its own metaphysics. I think both of them involve basic ontological assumptions, and really it's just up to us, how we're going to, to parse that, territory, and what are the effects of the decisions that we make. So that's kind of what leads me, at least in the direction of a pansemiotics or panpsychic orientation, especially if panpsychic is interpreted in a way that doesn't mean human mind all the way down.
There's different sets of inquiries, and they constrain each other in different ways. We hold those mutual constraints differently. Like the way I hold it is, here's your personal experience, which could be more or less, right? Could involve some very direct observations of what seems like universal consciousness or not. And it is very legitimate to constrain that with the best forms of science, both the physicalism of science, but also the reasoning processes behind the scientific method. And then, for me, I constrain that territory with a more basic philosophical inquiry into what is anything, which object-oriented ontology is there, sum of integral is there, because those first two rungs are making claims about things based on a presumption that we know what we're talking about. Right? I talk like I know what I'm talking about, and I'm available to be constrained by a good scientific argument that says I don't know what I'm talking about. But they're still talking about something. And there's this other set of people who are asking, how do we talk about anything at all? And ultimately, they have to provide the meta constraint somehow. Right? We don't know what a thing is. When we talk about the translation of differences between the hammer and the chair, we're assuming that hammers and chairs are things, right? And then you could contrast that against, a Ken Wilber style argument about holons and heaps, where the argument might say, look, there's no such thing as chairs. Of course, chairs don't have consciousness. Chairs don't exist. They're a collection of molecules. Molecules have consciousness. So that chair is 100% pervaded by consciousness, but the chair has no consciousness. Right? So these are the kind of distinctions, a kind of, advanced mereology or something of how are things related to their own parts? Where do things get their identities? Where do we draw the distinctions that identify items from other items? That's a huge argument that pertains to every dimension of the consideration of the consciousness question, but really never gets raised because it's extraordinarily difficult. Nobody who's doing science or having their own mystical experiences really has enough time to settle for themselves the question of what is something? What is an experience? Where does interior and exterior leave off? Am I a thing or am I a part of a thing? How could you possibly settle all these questions in advance of deciding the significance of your own experience of what pervasive consciousness implies? So at some level, you have to go with what you've experienced. However, a seemingly reasonable person, as cowardly and weak-minded as we are, at least verbally, says that we're willing to constrain that experience based on scientific evidence and scientific reasoning. If there's good scientific evidence and scientific reasoning that makes a point. Now, just the mood of materialistic reductionism is not itself a good scientific argument. It doesn't prove anything except the temperament of the people who are making that argument. They may not wish to consider this. They may weigh the significance of certain phenomenon differently than we do. I'm open to any kind of scientific critique. I love it. It's part of the wisdom of the universe. But I don't know that the temperament of a lot of people who are very specifically drawn to materialist science is always broad enough to incorporate the full range of phenomenon that should be integrated through the rational and scientific method, which I think they should in fact be working on.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
And, yep, you know, Bhaskar talks about the role of philosophy as an underlaborer for science. And it's not the role of philosophy basically to lord over science, to deliver a once and final, pronouncement about the ontological, state of the universe.
Yeah.
But it can help us inquire into what are the operative ontological assumptions in our framing of, an interpretation of scientific findings. And then, we can then engage, I think, hopefully, in a humble mode of inquiry around the adequacy of those assumptions. And
yeah.
No, go ahead. Yes, fine.
I was going to say there's these different, the answer kind of depends on the mode of engagement that you're involved in at the moment. I mean, when you're on retreat or in meditation, or when your primary concern is what's going to give your life the most meaning, then omnipresent consciousness, or even God, right? And that's a whole nother discussion about whether we can even use that kind of conception. But these sorts of ostensibly outdated metaphysical concepts may be entirely appropriate not only to the description of peak experiences, but to as heuristic devices that orient the person who's trying to align themselves with their best experiences, right? And that's in one zone of human endeavor. There's other zones of human endeavor where people want to find out the advancing frontier of knowledge, right? And the advancing frontier of knowledge has to carefully juggle reports of evidence and possibilities of evidence and what's real and what can we do without and what do we need. And then the description of what's thinkable in general, the philosophical problem, that's a whole different endeavor. And I think each of these endeavors, there's a different pragmatics in each endeavor. Mm-hmm. And it may be that ultimately the pragmatics determines what we can say is real. You're going to get into a loop of that at some point because something has to be real enough to allow you to do that. But the answers that people are comfortable with are going to be very different depending on which zone of engagement they're in. And they're very different for me depending on which zone of engagement I'm in. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm quite comfortable with universal consciousness when that's what's happening to me. As soon as I'm in a discussion about what are the objective facts of reality, I'm very willing to hear the possibility that it isn't there. And I wouldn't be bothered by that because the non-existence of consciousness, or even the non-existence of its ubiquity, would not impinge upon that other zone of engagement. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing at stake. I'm not threatened by that. But it's different depending on who I'm talking to and what mode I'm in and what I'm trying to achieve. I have a certain tendency myself in general to try to take positions that neutralize the differences. Right? I kind of make a dialectical position. I'm like, how could I take my anti-consciousness and my pro-consciousness argument and make them sound the same. What sentence justifies both of them?
Mm-hmm.
Right? How can I define universal awareness as basically what everyone means by no awareness at all? If I could do that in one sentence, I got both sides covered, I'm good. And that's fair. It's fun, it's liberating, it puts me in a good position in discussions. It doesn't solve the problem, but it indicates to me how I can be in front of the problem and where I would look for satisfactory philosophical solutions for myself.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately where we're aiming with this discussion is, I think, where can we land that in some sense we're saying yes to both sides without being weak-minded cowards, of course. But this really is more of an epistemological than an ontological question. But eliminativists, eliminative materialists would question our whole folk psychology and want to get rid of that, all the folk psychology concepts, and replace it with neuroscience. Our folk psychology can explain a complicated situation of political intrigue and power machinations and murder. Can you explain that purely from the level of neuroscience? I don't think so. Right? I don't think you can really account for everything only using neuroscientific reference. So there's, epistemologically, I think the folk psychology distinctions are going to remain in play, and that's at least an argument for keeping the four quadrants in play pragmatically at the level of human affairs. But then we're in this conversation, we're really looking deeper at do we need to extend that usefulness of the four quadrant domains at the level of human affairs? Do we gain anything by basically carrying those distinctions all the way down?
Yeah, and that's a really important contemplation for us all to stand in front of. It seems to me that in general, you run up against the infinities and paradoxes at the borders of every form of inquiry. Right? If you go, it's all neurological, then, well, go to the point that all perception is neurologically mediated, including what you think you're perceiving that's pre-mediation is neurologically mediated. And then your idea of your brain is just an idea in your brain. So you end up at loops, right? You get recursions, you get infinite regress. All of these phenomena indicate to me probably where there's a boundary between two epistemological domains. And you have to switch domains at those boundaries in order to make sense of them. Nonetheless, you have to challenge yourself constantly with the idea that it might not be necessary to use the idea sets that you've inherited. Now, that's a cautious one because it's not, to me, it's not as simple as folk wisdom is foolish and we've replaced it with facts. I'm very sensitive to the argument that folk wisdom was not, like Jordan Peterson's argument about mythology, it was not a set of claims about the external universe. Therefore, it was never replaced by a new set of claims about the external universe. That the people originally doing it were not telling each other what the material universe consists of. Their cosmology was not a description of the objects and how they got here. It was a description of psychological or trans-psychological dimensions of meaningful. It was how do we encounter things and what can we do with them is what they were describing. They weren't describing things. So their description, if you take that as serious, isn't replaced by a better description of things. And it may turn out that many things that seem to be irrational or old-fashioned descriptions have a tremendous amount of valid information in them that we don't know how to articulate. And in fact, they're valuable particularly because they transcend our articulation capacity. They're inherited from a billion years of adaptive response to a nonlinear environment that defies linear articulations. Problem is, we don't know which ones are really useful articulations of our adaptation to a complex environment and which ones are just folk bullshit. How do we tease that apart? That's an endless task for all of us. Mm-hmm. It's not so simple that we can take them at face value, and it's not so simple that we can throw them out in favor of objective facts. Nonetheless, we do have to ask ourselves whether the concepts we're using to organize either of those fields of knowledge are adequate. Right? I find I can't think about it without at least two. Right? If I want to go awareness and consciousness, consciousness doesn't go all the way down. Awareness does. That's nothing like my consciousness, which is an emergent phenomenon of awareness, right? I draw a gradient, I draw a spectrum. I need at least two. Maybe two isn't enough. If I was going to do the full science of it, maybe 5,000, maybe 18. I'm not sure anybody knows. But you have to be open to the need to unpack the concepts you're using for the organization, regardless of the fact that there's potential validity in irrational folk wisdom, and regardless of the fact that new facts replace old facts. In both of those cases, there's a metaphysics that's not just the philosophy of the universe, but it's a metaphysics that's bound into the concepts we're using for our investigation, and those concepts need to be unpacked either way. Because there's an old metaphysics and a new metaphysics, and the post-metaphysical mind has to be able to embrace and challenge both of them or all of them, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it requires, I think, a comfort with some degree of ontological pluralism, right? And that you have to recognize that that there are different facts that obtain in different domains, and part of the dance that we're doing in integral thinking, I think, is ontologically choreographing the different elements, to use my onto-choreography. And it's an ongoing dance and exchange, to see what is adequate to a situation and what really needs to be, put into question, which basically any point could be put into question eventually. So where does this leave us now? What territory have we covered? I feel comfortable to say, that we've given a pretty good yes to both sides, but is there more?
Well, like I was saying about my tendency, I have a kind of rhetoric where I attempt to find these statements that validate both sides simultaneously. Right? You get the two faces in the vase in one sentence, great. But that's not wholly satisfying to me. So where do I want to go from there? And then that depends on what domain you're looking at as well. Right? One question is, where do I want to go in terms of what's scientifically accurate about the world? Another question is, where do I want to go in terms of what are the terms that I'm going to use to think about the existence of things at all? Mm-hmm. And then another place I want to go is, where do I really want to go as a person in my feelings and experience of reality? Now, to me, that's the one that's going to get the +1. Mm-hmm. The real weight is on that side, but I'm very comfortable doing that with ambiguity, right? I don't need consciousness as a term, or awareness, or subjectivity, or interiority. They're all very interesting, some of them more plausible than others, going all the way down. I don't need that really for my spiritual life. I can call it something and I can go forward. Right? That I encountered a whatever, a somethingness that seemed to be like this. That's fine. I can bracket it or put it in quotes. It doesn't in any way impede upon my ability to develop what I think of as my deep and total beingness. So that gives me a lot of freedom to look at those other two domains. I don't think we need the concept of consciousness fundamentally to allow ourselves to pursue spiritual practice in a post-metaphysical sense. Where do we go in terms of what the science is? Where do we go in terms of what our ability to articulate reality is? Those are open domains. And another domain is what you brought up at the beginning, which is the politics of it, right? Is there a sense in which we want to tinker with words and terminology in order to make them more acceptable to minds that are either more enthusiastic or more skeptical, right? And you can make an argument about the way Wilbur has phrased his opus, that he's skewed himself by temperament or design toward a certain kind of spiritually oriented Westerner. And he didn't need to skew it that way. And maybe you could skew it the other way toward somebody who's 80-20 toward skeptical materialism. On the other hand, you could make that same complaint. Why skew it in any direction? Should we be trying to play that game? Is that game good politics, to try to tailor your terminology to the acceptability of hypothetical critics? Or is that, in the Trump universe, is that already a discredited mode of politics in which what you should do is double down on your own craziness instead of doing the always failing liberal strategy of trying to pre-account for the criticisms of your opponents and backing yourself into a moderation, which loses elections? I don't know. That would be my concern.
Right. Yeah, alternative facts. Are we dealing with alternative facts here?
Yeah. Do we want the word consciousness? Is it doing us any good?
I'm totally okay to get rid of it.
Okay, me too.
Yeah. Just like enlightenment and most of other books.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And I think a 2018 Pew Research poll determined we were the two most integral dudes there are. This is saying something. If we're both going to dismember consciousness and chuck it out the door, maybe it's time for a new concept that does the same thing we want it to do, but in a more nuanced way that jives better with emerging scientific materialist realities. Right.
Yeah, I think that's something I would want to give to, even though I'm not on board with Patricia and Paul Churchland in terms of their whole project. But their basic claim that, that we've inherited a lot of concepts from an earlier time, and they may have been doing work that, they can't function as well in the new territory. So this is the other topic that you and I were talking about in terms of the usefulness of terminology, and whether we want to bring in new terminology or repurpose old terminology. And maybe we can actually go into that in more depth in another talk, but just touching on it lightly, yes, I see some value in retaining consciousness and repurposing it, redefining it. But I also I see, the emerging complex territory and I see that consciousness is being used actually in pretty loose ways to cover a whole range of phenomena. And part of the things that bogs down conversations in this area, including within the integral community, is the many disparate ways that we're even holding the concept of consciousness.
Yeah.
And it muddies the water, right? So to reach for some new precision, I think is valuable, whether we bring in new terms, we ground them in, more fully in, I would say, cognitive neuroscience, but also probably neurophenomenology. The whole work that is emerging with the disciplined pursuit of refined phenomenological experience in conjunction with neurological observations. We might be able to come up with new vocabulary here. So I can see value on both sides of that, which is probably not satisfying yet.
It's a good conversation, but it's a terrible debate. We're both on both sides of every issue. I'm like, yeah, I'm torn on the terminology issue, and it could easily be another debate, which we probably should do, because we could dig down on words like God, for example. Right? And is that a useful word to carry forward and give a nuanced meaning to, or is it a discredited, clumsy word that we should replace with something more precise?
Right.
Those are both strategies for improving the precision of our concepts and vocabulary, and they both have different moral justifications, both of which feel very valid to me. I like both of them. It bothers me. Well, I love to create new terms that capture my new idea, but I hate when I see people rejecting old terms because they think the old terms are contaminated. I feel like they've given ground unnecessarily, right? My argument is always, you let somebody else define the word and then you determined they were an idiot and backed off from the word, right? That's the cowardly approach. Why didn't you decide that your definition of the word was correct and that they were a fool? You're being the one who reacts to a fool. That's not a sane strategy.
Right.
And I think what I love about that is I think that's what the ancient philosophers did. Right? They were not as engaged in rebranding as we are today. And it's possible that the linguistic turn is an ideological side effect of the corporate universe in which branding and rebranding permeates all of our lives. We're all in a marketing culture now to some degree, and that might hypersensitize us to terminology in a way that our ancestors weren't. And they were much more comfortable picking up a word they were given and imbuing it with the full range of meaning they were capable of moving forward with. And I respect that enormously.
Do you know the word noseme? I'm actually going to be butchering its meaning in some sense, but G-N-O-S-E-M-E, noseme or nosemic. I think Anagarika Govinda was, one of those fake Buddhists, fake Tibetans. Who was that other guy? Rob Jam? What's his name? Anyway, one of those fake German Tibetans. He used to use that term, noseme, and basically, though, it's the recognition that there's, that words can be vehicles of power, but held in a metaphysical sense or post-metaphysical sense, in a way that we recognize the potency, of language, and the rootedness, of language in many past regimes of meaning. And there's a way to play with that and capitalize on that that is not necessarily obscuring. There's an empowerment in that ambiguity, not only an obscuring. So I think that's probably a topic for our next round.
Yeah, let's do that one.
Okay. Yeah, I feel anything that you'd like to conclude with on this topic regarding consciousness all the way down.
No, I mean, I think we've covered it reasonably well. I mean, to me, it's an experience you definitely can have and definitely should have, around which the mandala of your life should be based. Do you need the word consciousness to describe that? Do you need to think of it as a universalized extrapolation of the kind of psychology that you have? No, you don't. Should you constantly try to enfold scientific criticism and materialist data into your worldview? Absolutely. Do we know what the things are at the basis of reality? No. And that leads us to question the metaphysics of conventional scientific materialist thought just as much as it leads us to question the metaphysical assumptions of folk thought. They're both sets of metaphysics, and the post-metaphysical approach to consciousness has to critique what we might call the colloquial ideas of the scientific community just as much as it critiques the inherited folk concepts.
Yes. I think That's well put, and I am almost at the end of my battery, so it's a good point to leave it the last word. I would like to say, just taking Steve McIntosh's recommendation, really, that integral can serve as a kind of philosophical interpreter and mediator across domains of concern, whether it's religion or science or law or anthropology, other domains, and wedding that to Bhaskar's sense of underlaboring. I think that's it's a serious, profound practice. I think our conversation here, while not arriving at a hard final point, to me, I don't see it as waffling, but really as I think a recognition of ultimately the value that integral can play as a philosophical underlaborer across domains, and the distinctions that we draw and the lines the stands that we take will actually depend on kind of the mode of veridiction that we're engaged in at the moment.
Yeah, I think integral could be and is basically an interperspectival operating system.
Right.
Right, and there's what we see in that space is what we see in that space. There's no particular theory that's going to necessarily dominate that. It just gives us the opportunity to bring those things together and make patterns between different valid perspectives. And those patterns are going to look different because everybody's going to hold a conjunction of those valid perspectives in a different way.
Right. Yeah, integral as a prepositional operator, we're bringing things into proximity, into your adjacency.
Yeah, it's more like it's a set of the things you should have to take seriously and render some sort of coherence out of.
Right.
And there can be very diverse and very disagreeing ways of doing that, but they're all on the same team if they're all speaking a common language and trying to make coherence out of these viewpoints.
Right.
But then we get back to the same philosophical problem: is what are the viewpoints, right? Like, if consciousness is a screen word that covers 10 other words with different meanings, what do we know about a perspective? Is a perspective really a perspective, or is there a cover for 4.5 other perspectives? Right? We need to get past our terminology one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, at least this is
battery's done.
Yeah. At least this is a step halfway into the bush. We'll see where we go from here. Right?
Okay. I enjoyed this. I always enjoy talking to you. This is great. Let's do the terminology one.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that next.
All right. Love you, Bruce.
Love you too. Take care. Bye.